Hello, I just wanted to add a few things to the discussion of socialism at the end of the last video. This is really focused on a comparison between two groups, so two unions. One would be the AFL, and the other would be the Wobblies, sometimes known as the Industrial Workers of the World. In both of these groups, there's quite a spectrum of people. So, there's, a lot of arguments in between the groups, but some of the things that distinguish them, whereas the AFL is really focused on preserving capitalism, but is interested in working on reforms specifically for skilled workers, largely white skilled workers. This is a nativist union because the idea of, enabling replacement of workers, from outside is something that the union doesn't want to see occur. So we can really put them into that group of people that are quite nativist. We see that, with the free soilers and, older groups too. With the industrial workers of the world, this is a group that is largely socialist in nature and kind of adopts some beliefs. Eugene Debs would be one of these people. There's a lot of other significant people who connect to the industrial workers of the world, and perhaps some people even advocate the use of violence as a tool or strikes, in order to make a message, but that's not necessarily everyone. That tends to vary, in terms of, where people fall. But the socialist ideology is really one that is based on some of the ideas of Karl Marx. So, whereas the AFL is only skilled workers, the industrial workers of the world would be skilled and unskilled. So this would be like workers as the masses. So very inclusive. In fact, there's quite a few women leaders in the IWW. This would be like Lucy Parsons, the piece that you read in class. She's a socialist. You have people like Gurley Flynn. You've got a few different women that are really significant, right? Mother Jones, these are people who are very influential and lean socialist. So what do we mean by, Marxist socialism, and what would that, kind of mean people believed? A lot of this is really about the critique of capitalism and perhaps even the belief that capitalism as an economic system could potentially destroy itself, self-destruct, not be, kind of fitting for the time. One of the things that Marx discusses, because he's Prussian, he writes in like the 1840s, maybe a little bit later. Some of his works include the Communist Manifesto, which is like a speech, and Das Kapital, which is a book that he writes closer to the time of his death. And Das Kapital is very much about the critique of capitalism, and people who are Marxist might argue that Marx kind of has a certain lens that he sees the world, and that lens is connected to a dialectic, which means kind of a uh, two competing things that create some tension. And, if you think about Marx seeing the world through the lens of a class struggle, he identifies in some of his theories the bourgeoisie, or the capitalist owning class, and then also the workers, the proletariat, kind of the little people. These would be like the little people in The Wizard of Oz, right? They're literally the little people. But the idea of the workers not really having, the same advantages in a capitalist system that the capital owning class does. And so some of this has to do with the way Marx sees the like structure of industrial times. So there's like political and social kind of structures, and then there's like an economic system that kind of goes along with that. When you have things that are out of sorts, you kind of get some tension and you get things that don't work the way they're supposed to. So industrialization, in other words, like kind of creates like this new organization for the economy, and there's still like structures that are not organized that way. So part of like the big picture of Marxism is there's some mismatching going on that creates a large amount of conflict and tension in the political, social, economic system. You also have kind of some very specific theories and critiques of capitalism. Marx predicts, for example, that firms will progressively get larger and larger and larger. He also predicts that, for a time, capitalism might create wealth for a nation, kind of like what Adam Smith wrote about in 1776 in his book. But then he suggests that there will be a whole bunch of like cyclical failures that won't, we won't see increases in wages and things that are supposed to happen in the market that would make the market kind of sustainable as a wealth making machine go kaflooey. And one of the issues that he points his finger at is like what we'll call the exploitation of workers, but this notion of the surplus value, the way workers kind of bring more value to the development of a product, and essentially they don't get that same value back. They get like a minimum wage or a living wage, but they don't necessarily get the value of their production. And Marx also feels like this is alienating industrialization, is basically alienating workers from the craft and their pride, in their work. And so what people get from work is completely missing, in industrial society. And, it's something we could even think about in our own day and age, right? When work is a source of pride and when it is not, right? And of course, we know we all have to do the things we don't want to do, but, there is a difference between those kinds of work, right? And so some of what Marx is critiquing is like the incentives and the various like ways that the system is built doesn't necessarily give workers the same degree of benefits. Capitalists are the ones who really benefit from the system. And Marx feels that in time, a different system is going to have to replace it. And, this could come about with a revolution of workers versus capitalists. And there are people in the early 1900s who kind of see this potentially happening. And so the IWW is like a forum for some of that because it is an advocacy for socialism. Not all socialists think exactly like Karl Marx. There's a whole bunch of people in the time period who we would call utopian thinkers, people who want to live life in a very different kind of way with a small group of people, maybe in a space that's outside of the industrial envelope, but it's much less about the political and economic structure of society. To Marx, there's a very specific cause of what's going on, and his socialism is connected to those causes. As he describes it as scientific socialism. There are many other people who start their own communities and like live off the grid, so to speak. And some of those folks become very significant utopian socialist thinkers who are perhaps more idealistic about the ways in which cooperation and humankind can live, right? So, to Marx, there's a much more structural aspect of things that can be designed differently. Other socialists don't necessarily agree with that. But just so you have one last slide, the IWW actually has a lot of really big significance in Paterson, New Jersey. On the left, that's a house of the mayor in Halden, because the mayor of Halden was actually socialist. So a lot of workers who were socialist leaning in Paterson, these would be textile workers, oftentimes would, meet on the lawn in Halden because they wouldn't really get so oppressed. They could meet, they could unionize without really getting in trouble. So you can see some of the degree of what was happening, and people would stand on the porch of the Halden house. Now it's called the Botto home because it was at the time an Italian family known as the Bottos. But the people would, leading socialists would come out and speak, on the porch. And so people would get, some of that. And this is in the turn of the century. You can see on the right the pageant of the Patterson strike. In order to make money for people who were on strike because they weren't paid, they actually did a theater. So this is like they take the Patterson strike, create essentially a play about the Patterson strike, and put the play on at Madison Square Garden. And this is deemed to be sold as tickets. You can see the price of the seats, at like $2 or $1.50 or $1 or whatever. You could actually go see this. And this particular poster, is advertising this pageant. And we get a sense of like the framework of the Wobblies, which is maybe a little bit more aggressive as a union. They were known in some cases for using violence. They also become attached with international movements. So there are worker movements in other countries too. As the Russian Revolution builds closer and closer to 1917, we see a lot of American labor activists, especially socialists, connecting to the Russian Revolution. There's a movie, I want to say from the 1980s, called Reds, and it's all about the collective group of people in the U.S., people like Eugene O'Neill or Jack Reed, who was a newspaper reporter from Greenwich Village, how they kind of became engaged in the right for working people, and got attached to the kind of socialist international, and it becomes like kind of a really big thing. Some people even go to Russia during the Russian Revolution. Jack Reed, who's the reporter, comes back and had written a book, 10 Days That Shook the World, all about the Russian Revolution, right? And he's an American. I think his body is actually buried over in Russia. So there's some like connection, to international history as well. Okay, so that's a little bit about this, kind of putting it in the space of unions and things like that. If you have other questions, there are leading anarchists too. So somebody like an Emma Goldman would be really important for somebody who is an anarchist. Also somebody who advocated in some cases the use of violence, but also was involved in things like ensuring birth control. And so, people who kind of thought outside the box oftentimes are involved in a variety of things. Emma Goldman is somebody who was an immigrant to the United States from Russia, I believe, and she was actually deported in the time period that we're talking about for some of her political beliefs. But she had a boyfriend by the name of Alex Berkman, and I don't know if they were together, or they were just professionally together. So I might have the romance part of that incorrect. But in any case, Berkman was accused of trying to assassinate Frick after the Homestead strike. So after the Homestead strike is over, Frick is actually almost assassinated, and the individual who goes to jail for that was a well-known anarchist at the time who was connected to Emma Goldman. So, a couple of people who are in the anarchist box also. Okay, be well. I will see you in class.